In fact, if you look at, say, very skeptical biblical scholars, like non-believing, atheist, agnostic Christian scholars, they will say if we can know anything about Jesus, like they'll cast a doubt on a lot of the things that we read about in the Gospels in terms of the actual historical Jesus of Nazareth. They'll say one thing we can be sure of is that he died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Because we have not just multiple attested documents that we refer to as the New Testament, but Roman and Greek and Jewish writers refer to that claim afterwards and talk about the fact that you have this guy, and it's mocked within earliest Christianity. So one of our earliest, in fact, not one of, the earliest depiction of Jesus on the cross is called the Alexamenos Graphido. And it's probably from the end of the 1st century. And it's it depicts an individual with their arms raised in an act of worshiping a man with a donkey's head who's being crucified.
Whoa.
And right beside it, it says Alexamenos worships his God in Greek.
Whoa.
And it's mocking, right? Because crucifixion was for the lowest of the low. It was for like slaves. In fact, if you were a Roman citizen, you were banned from being crucified.
Who was it that got crucified upside down?
Peter.
Why? Was it because like regular crucifixion wasn't good enough for him? Or what was he didn't deserve it because Christ had gone through it?
Well, so the story is that they say, we're going to crucify you. And he says, it's like too big of an honor to die like my Lord. And they say, well, we can fix that.
Oh, Jesus. Shut your mouth, buddy.
Listen, the Romans were pretty brutal.
Oh, yeah.
But this is why we know, like it's interesting. We know a lot about crucifixion, but crucifixion was seen as so disgusting. I believe it was Cicero who said that like the word crucifixion shouldn't even be on a Roman man's lips.
Wow.
I mean, the word excruciating,
right.
Ex is off of in Latin, and crus, off the cross. So that's where we get that word, is because this was designed to humiliate, and it was designed to be as painful as possible. There was actually a really good article done by JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, which was done by a number of, I think it was in the 70s or the early 80s. It was done by a group of biblical scholars and then medical professionals. And so they looked at the conventions of what we do know about Roman crucifixion, and then they looked at the descriptions in the gospel to try to figure out, okay, if we could diagnose how Jesus died, how would he have died? And so they basically came up with this idea that he probably asphyxiated to death. You kind of drown in your own blood. But the chances of Jesus surviving the crucifixion, I think, are narrow to none. And the chance of him appearing 3 days later completely fine, I mean, if the first thing you do, if you survive a crucifixion and then you go and you find your disciples, the first thing you say is not, peace be with you. It's
right.
Get me to a hospital, right?
Did they have them back then?
No, not really.
Also, are we entirely certain of their measurement of days?
So this is an interesting question because of the differences between when the Gospel of John says Jesus died compared to the Synoptics, because John appears to be using the Roman convention of counting time, and the other Gospels, when they describe the timing, appear to be using the Jewish ones. And actually, if you correlate between the two, they match up pretty well. So the thing is, with Jews, any part of a day was considered a day. So 3 days and 3 nights becomes almost an idiom for any part of that day is the day. So if Jesus, and because they count evening and morning, evening to morning is the day, it's very possible that it wasn't like how we would think of 3 24-hour days, especially if he dies on Friday and wakes up on Sunday.
So that would actually make it less time than more time.
Yeah.
It's not like he had recovery time.
Oh, no, he didn't have recovery time.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm kind of getting. It's not like it was 3 days, it was actually 3 months.
Oh, no.
Yeah,
no, not like that.
Then 400 people saw him afterwards.
That's the claim that Paul makes.
Paul makes this claim.
Yeah.
And how many different people have some sort of a recollection or a writing or something that's attributed to them of being witness to his resurrection?
Well, you have Peter, Paul, Jude, James, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The thing with Matthew, Mark, and Luke is that Matthew and John are attributed to direct disciples of Jesus. Luke and Mark are not. So they are not eyewitnesses within the Jesus community. In fact, Luke prefaces his gospel by saying that. He's right up front about this. He's like, hey, I'm not an eyewitness. Don't confuse me with an eyewitness. But he actually uses conventional writing. What's the term I'm looking for? He uses writing conventions of the day that would fit within regular biography that was written within the Roman world. So you have a guy named Quintilian who is basically, I mentioned him before with the, he's teaching people how to write. And he says that if you're going to write biography, you need to be interviewing eyewitnesses and you can't be too far away from the event to be able to write these things. And Quintilian, Lucian, and Josephus, who are all these very prominent ancient biographers and writers of history, have a lot of crossover in the way they describe how you should write history with the words that Luke uses at the beginning of his gospel, where he says, I'm interviewing eyewitnesses and I'm writing up an orderly account. And so he's saying, I'm going to use these methods that are expected as good history of my day. I'm not an eyewitness, so I'm going to try to find the people who are eyewitnesses, and I'm going to try to encapsulate this within a document that communicates what is being written.
Well, that's also why it's so interesting trying to put your mind into the context of people that lived back then when you try to interpret what these stories were all about, because they did believe in things that weren't real. So when they talk about this thing that we're supposed to believe is real, when you have all this evidence that they believe things that aren't true.
Yeah.
It's interesting, right? Because like you're now saying, yeah, but this one really was true.
Right.
Well, there's so many different things that they thought of and believed that weren't true.
Yeah. So this historiographically is, so when we do history, it's an inference to the best explanation. Mm-hmm. And so there are probabilities of things that have happened in history where we can say, okay, there's a higher probability of event A happening and a lower probability of event B happening. So the example I often give is like Jonah being swallowed by the fish. Like that's low probabilistically, not that it didn't happen, but that like as a historian we gotta like say, well, there's no independent cross-reference sources. You don't have multiple attestation for this particular event. The interesting thing about Jesus is that we have more evidence from different writings in the ancient world than we probably should have for someone of his stature, because we have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, these 4 biographies. There's really only one other person in and around that time that can claim to have that much kind of independent testimony of their life, and it's the Roman Emperor Tiberius. So he also has 4 biographers. He has Cassio Dio, Suetonius, Tacitus, and Velius Paterculus. And so the Roman emperor, who's the most famous, most powerful person at the time, has a similar amount of historiographical evidence biographically for his, the events of his lifetime that Jesus does.